The air inside the concrete walls of the county fairgrounds pavilion was thick with the scent of stale diesel, damp earth, and the unmistakable, bitter tang of desperation. It was a Tuesday morning, a time when honest men should have been out in the fields, watching the early mist rise off the topsoil. Instead, over 200 people were crammed into rows of folding plastic chairs, their eyes fixed on the elevated wooden stage where an auctioneer stood behind a scuffed podium. To the casual observer, this looked like any other liquidation sale, a routine dispersal of mechanical scrap, old iron, and broken dreams. But to the men sitting in the front row, wearing tailored navy blurs and carrying leather-bound folios, it was an execution. The corporate restructuring of the Blackwood Valley was entering its final phase, and the last remnants of the independent homesteads were being systematically carved up for pennies on the dollar. Arthur Vance sat near the back, his calloused hands resting heavily on his knees. He wore his only good canvas jacket, the collar frayed but clean, and an old baseball cap with the logo faded to an indistinguishable gray blur. At 72 years old, Arthur was a man shaped by the land, possessing the quiet, immovable posture of an old oak tree. For months, his neighbors had watched his steady decline as the commercial bank squeezed his credit lines, choked his operational capital, and finally forced his family's century-old homestead into a mandatory asset liquidation. The crowd around him was split cleanly down the center. On one side stood the remaining local farmers, their faces etched with grim solidarity and a quiet, simmering anger. On the other side sat the representatives of Vanguard Agricultural Holdings, a massive real estate conglomerate that had spent the last 3 years buying up bankrupt parcels across 3 counties to build a massive, automated logistics hub. On the stage, the auctioneer, a fast-talking man named Miller whose voice had been reduced to a rhythmic, raspy drone after 3 hours of continuous chanting, gestured toward a large projection screen. The screen displayed Lot 414. It was a pathetic sight, a 1972 Massey Ferguson tractor, its iconic red paint oxidized into a dull, chalky pink, its rear tires completely flat and cracked by decades of exposure to the elements. The engine block was partially disassembled, a nest of rusted manifold pipes protruding like broken ribs. It was, by all objective accounts, a useless hunk of industrial garbage, valued purely for its weight in scrap metal. "All right, folks, moving right along to Lot 414, Miller droned into his lapel microphone, his eyes barely skimming over the crowd. "We have a vintage utility tractor, sold as is, non-operational, title clear but non-registered for road use. Perfect project piece for a collector or a solid haul for the scrapyard. Let's start the bidding at $500. Do I hear 500? Silence stretched across the room. Not a single hand went up. The farmers in the back row looked down at their boots, they had no money to waste on dead iron. The corporate buyers in the front row didn't even look up from their tablet screens. The tractor was an irrelevance to them, an unsightly piece of debris that they would eventually have to pay a hauling crew to remove from the property once they took possession of the acreage. 400. Miller tried again, his tone dropping an octave, betraying his desire to speed through the remaining junk lots before lunch. 300. Come on, gentlemen, there's at least $300 worth of cast iron in the chassis alone. Give me 200. Still, the room remained dead. The auctioneer sighed, a brief puff of air hitting the microphone with a soft pop. "All right, looking for an opening bid. Any opening bid just to clear the ledger and move to the real estate parcels. Give me a number." Arthur Vance slowly raised his right hand, his index finger pointing toward the corrugated steel ceiling. His voice was not loud, but in the dead silence of the pavilion, it carried with absolute clarity. $9. A brief, stunned silence blanketed the room, as if the crowd's collective brain was struggling to process the absurdity of the figure. Then, a low chuckle rippled through the front row. One of the Vanguard attorneys, a young man with slick back hair and a pristine gray suit, turned around in his chair, a wide, patronizing smirk plastered across his face. Within seconds, the chuckle turned into open, unbridled laughter. It started with the corporate delegation and quickly infected the casual onlookers in the middle rows. To them, it was the ultimate act of a defeated, broken man, a pathetic, single-digit gesture of defiance from a farmer who had lost everything and was now reduced to bidding pocket change on a piece of useless junk. Miller, the auctioneer, frowned, looking down at his ledger and then over at Arthur. He raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed by what he assumed was a senile prank or an emotional outburst from a man losing his livelihood. "Sir, did I hear you correctly? Did you say $9? $9, Arthur repeated firmly, his expression entirely blank. He didn't look at the men laughing at him. He didn't flush with embarrassment. He simply kept his hand raised, his eyes locked onto the auctioneer's gavel. "That is my opening bid. And according to the county asset liquidation guidelines under Section 4B, if an item fails to meet the minimum reserve and is designated as scrap tier clearance, the floor must accept any legal tender offer to initiate the bidding sequence." The laughter in the front row died down slightly, replaced by a few curious whispers. The young Vanguard attorney leaned over to his colleague, shaking his head. "Look at him," he whispered loudly enough for the rows behind him to hear. "The old man wants to buy a tombstone for his farm. Let him have it for $9. It'll cost him more than that just to tow the carcass off our new land." The auctioneer hesitated, his finger running down the printed rules attached to his clipboard. Arthur was technically correct. In a mandatory judicial foreclosure sale, every asset had to be processed. They could not simply skip a lot without a formal withdrawal request from the lien holder. Miller cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Very well. I have an opening bid of $9 from the floor. $9 once. Do I hear any counteroffers?" He looked toward the front row, fully expecting one of the corporate buyers to bid $50 just to be cruel, or to secure the scrap. But the Vanguard representatives merely smiled, amused by the theater of the old man's public humiliation. They chose to remain silent, enjoying the spectacle. $9 twice, Miller said, his gavel hovering above the wooden block. $9, and 3 times, Miller intoned, his voice dropping into a flat, mechanical cadence as his arm swung downward. The sharp crack of the wooden gavel striking the podium echoed through the pavilion like a pistol shot. A few more scattered snickers broke out among the corporate delegation in the front row, accompanied by a mock round of applause from the young Vanguard attorney. Arthur Vance did not blink. He slowly lowered his hand, reached into his canvas jacket pocket, pulled out a crisp $5 bill and 4 singles, and laid them neatly on the edge of the clerk's registration desk to his left. The clerk, a tired-looking woman named Martha who had known Arthur's family for 40 years, looked at the money, then up at Arthur with a mixture of profound pity and confusion. She quietly stamped the asset transfer slip, filling in the transaction details for Lot 414, 1972 Massey Ferguson utility tractor, serial number MF 74109X. Purchaser, Arthur Vance. Price, $9. Congratulations, Arthur, the Vanguard attorney sneered, turning around in his seat to lock eyes with the old farmer. You just bought yourself a $9 paperweight. Make sure you get it off our property by 5 o'clock Friday, or we'll have the county sheriff impound it as abandoned refuse. Arthur did not return the insult. He simply folded his copy of the yellow carbon receipt, placed it securely inside his breast pocket, and took his seat once again. His face remained an unreadable mask of weathered stone. The auctioneer cleared his throat loudly, eager to move past the bizarre interlude and get to the main event that everyone in the room was actually there for. He adjusted his glasses, tapped his microphone twice, and brought up the next slide on the projection screen. The image changed from the rusted tractor to a high-resolution, color-coded satellite map of the entire Blackwood Valley, outlined in a thick, aggressive red border. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now moving to the primary asset category of this morning's liquidation, Miller announced, his energy instantly returning as the stakes skyrocketed. This is Lot 415, the Vance Homestead and Agricultural Parcel. We are talking about 240 acres of prime, contiguous agricultural land, including the historical residential structure, 3 commercial-grade storage barns, and all associated subterranean rights, excluding municipal utility easements. The primary lien holder, First Federal Credit Corp., has established an opening judicial reserve of $450,000. I will open the floor for bidding at the reserve price. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The casual amusement that had filled the air during the tractor sale evaporated, replaced by a tense, heavy silence. The local farmers sat up straighter, their jaws clenched. This was the moment they had dreaded for over a year, the formal, legal erasure of the Vance family from the Valley history books. The lead attorney for Vanguard Holdings, a senior partner named Marcus Sterling who had remained silent during the previous proceedings, casually raised a small plastic bidding paddle. Vanguard bids the reserve. $450,000. I have $450,000 from the front row, Miller chanted, his voice slipping back into its rapid-fire auction cadence. 450, now looking for 475. Do I hear 475? Anyone in the back? 475. The farmers looked at each other, but no one moved. In a depressed agricultural market, crushed by consecutive years of artificial drought and manipulated supply chain costs, none of the locals had that kind of liquid capital. They were completely priced out of their own ecosystem. 450,000 once, Miller called out, looking directly at Sterling, who was already whispering to his assistants about the layout of the logistics hub they planned to break ground on next month. 450,000 twice. Arthur Vance slowly stood up for the second time. He did not raise his hand to bid. Instead, he pulled a thick, blue-bound legal folio from underneath his canvas jacket, a document that looked incredibly old, its edges yellowed and bound by heavy brass grommets. Point of order, Mr. Auctioneer, Arthur said, his voice cutting through the rapid-fire chant with a cold, precise authority that made Miller freeze mid-word, his gavel suspended 3 inches above the podium. Marcus Sterling paused, his smile faltering slightly as he turned his head to look back at the old farmer. Mr. Vance, Sterling said, his voice dripping with smooth, professional condescension. The bidding rules are quite clear. If you do not possess a certified bank draft to match or exceed our corporate bid, you do not have standing to disrupt the proceeding. Please sit down and let the professional process conclude. I am not bidding on the land, Mr. Sterling, Arthur replied calmly. He stepped out of the row of chairs, walking down the center aisle toward the stage with a slow, deliberate stride. I am raising a formal objection to the validity of the lot description itself. According to the state executive law on judicial foreclosures, Section 12C, an auctioneer cannot legally execute the transfer of a real estate parcel if the advertised lot description contains a material defect concerning unseverable appurtenant easements. The auctioneer frowned, looking over at the bank's legal representative, who was sitting at a separate table near the stage. Mr. Vance, this title search was conducted by First Federal's Compliance Department. It was cleared 3 weeks ago. Then First Federal's Compliance Department forgot how to read historical county charters, Arthur said, placing his blue-bound folio directly onto the clerk's desk with a heavy, solid thud. He opened it to a page marked with a red plastic tab. This is the Blackwood Valley Water and Irrigation Charter of 1974. It was ratified during the construction of the county reservoir system to protect the original homesteads from being starved out by future industrial development. Sterling chuckled dryly, leaning back in his chair. An outdated water rights claim? Arthur, please. Your family's personal water allocations were legally severed and forfeited when your operational credit lines went into default under the terms of the restructuring agreement you signed last April. The bank owns those rights now. The bank owns the riparian rights tied to the agricultural usage, yes, Arthur said, turning a page in the document. But they do not own the primary flow easement. Let me read directly from the ratified charter text, which remains an active, unamended statutory law in this county. Arthur adjusted his glasses and read aloud, "Be it resolved that the continuous, uninhibited flow of the western spillway gate is legally tied in perpetuity to the operational mechanical asset designated as the Valley Warden. This asset, defined by its physical chassis and unique manufacturer serial number, holds the sole, non-severable, non-transferable easement to access, regulate, and clear the primary irrigation sluices for the entire lower valley basin." The room went dead silent. The young Vanguard attorney blinked, looking over at Sterling. What is he talking about? What the hell is a Valley Warden? Arthur looked directly at Marcus Sterling, a faint, razor-sharp smile finally appearing on his weathered face. In 1974, my father didn't want the county or any future corporation to ever be able to shut off our water. So he legally deeded the valley's primary infrastructure easement not to the land itself, and not to our family name, but to the physical machine required to manually operate the old mechanical spillway pump in the event of an electrical grid failure. That machine is registered in this charter by its exact manufacturer serial number, MF74109X. Arthur reached into his pocket and tapped his yellow receipt. My 1972 Massey Ferguson tractor, which I just bought from this auction block for $9. And whose title is now legally and completely in my name. Marcus Sterling's face didn't just drop, it hardened into a mask of pure, corporate hostility. He stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his tailored jacket, though his fingers trembled slightly with a sudden surge of adrenaline. He looked down at the younger associates flanking him, his voice a hushed, furious whisper. Get the compliance file for the Vance property. Now. Look at the asset schedule appendix. Find me that serial number. The front row erupted into a flurry of frantic activity. Laptops were snapped open, the glow of spreadsheets illuminating the pale, panicked faces of the Vanguard legal team. Keyboards clattered like a hail of stones against glass as they scrambled through thousands of pages of digitized title registries, searching for a single alphanumeric string that they had dismissed as an irrelevant piece of historical background noise. On stage, the auctioneer looked utterly bewildered. He glanced from Arthur's calm, steady gaze to the frantic corporate huddle in the front row. Mr. Vance, Miller said, taking off his glasses to wipe his brow, even if what you're saying is accurate, a water easement attached to a piece of movable personal property is highly irregular. The bank's foreclosure action covers all structures and improvements on the land. It's not irregular, Mr. Auctioneer, it's an appurtenant easement by necessity, explicitly written into the county's civil engineering framework to prevent a monopoly over the valley's water supply, Arthur countered, his voice perfectly level. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at the blue folio. Look at the 1974 infrastructure map appended to the charter. The mechanical spillway pump house sits directly on the boundary line between my property and the state reservoir. The only way to legally access or activate that pump house is through the physical presence of the registered mechanical asset. The charter explicitly states that the easement cannot be severed from the machine's chassis without a unanimous vote from the Valley's Agricultural District Board, a board that hasn't met since 1991, and of which I am the last surviving elected member. This is absurd. Sterling interrupted, stepping out into the aisle, his voice booming across the pavilion to regain control of the room. Mr. Auctioneer, this is nothing more than a desperate, bad-faith ambush designed to stall a legitimate judicial sale. The tractor is a piece of non-functional junk. It cannot operate a spillway pump, it can barely support its own weight on 4 flat tires. The mechanical functionality of the asset is entirely irrelevant to its statutory status, Mr. Sterling, Arthur said, turning to face the high-powered lawyer. The law doesn't care if a king's crown is made of gold or plastic, so long as it's the crown recognized by the Constitution. This county's charter recognizes serial number MF74109X as the exclusive holder of the Western Spillway easement. By allowing me to purchase that specific asset for $9 before you bid on the land, the bank has accidentally separated the primary water access control from the real estate parcel. The lead attorney for First Federal Credit Corp., a middle-aged woman named Henderson who had been quietly monitoring the sale from the side of the stage, suddenly stood up. Her face had gone completely pale. She had a tablet in her hand, displaying a scanned document from 40 years ago. Marcus, Henderson said, her voice strained as she called out to Sterling. He's right about the registry. The bank's original title search flagged the 1974 charter, but our automated system classified it as an expired agricultural subsidy agreement. We didn't cross-reference the equipment serial numbers in the historical appendix because the tractor was listed on the farm's personal property tax exemption ledger, not the primary real estate deed. A collective gasp swept through the rows of local farmers. Then, a slow, deep chuckle began in the back of the room, growing in volume as the sheer magnitude of the mistake dawned on them. The corporate giants, with their algorithms, multi-million-dollar legal teams, and aggressive acquisition strategies, had been completely undone by their own technological arrogance. They had relied on automated software to scan property titles, and the software had missed a grandfathered, machine-tied easement written by an old-school farmer over 4 decades ago. Let me break down exactly what this means for your logistics hub, Mr. Sterling, Arthur continued, his tone cutting through the mounting murmurs like a scalpel. You can buy my 240 acres today. You can pay the bank $450,000, or $4 million. But without the tractor I bought for $9, you cannot legally access the Western Spillway Pump House. And according to the federal environmental runoff restrictions governing the reservoir basin, you cannot build a single square foot of concrete foundation within 3 miles of that pump house without a signed operational clearance from the easement holder. Arthur leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Sterling's with an icy intensity. And right now, the easement holder is sitting in a pair of dirty work boots at the back of this room. Sterling's composure shattered. He whirled around toward his team, his voice cracking with rage. Find a loophole. Check the bankruptcy filing. Did he declare the tractor as an exempt asset in his Chapter 7 petition? If he didn't list it, the title belongs to the bankruptcy trustee, not him. The young associate's fingers flew across his keyboard, his face drenched in sweat. I'm checking the schedules now, sir. Page 12, item 14. Oh no. No, he didn't list it as an exempt asset because it wasn't part of the bankruptcy estate. The bank explicitly demanded the tractor be excluded from the corporate debt restructuring so it could be sold at this public auction to settle a separate, outstanding equipment lien. We forced it onto the auction block ourselves. The realization hit the Vanguard legal team like a physical blow. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the ventilation fans overhead and the rapid, shallow breathing of Marcus Sterling. He stood frozen in the aisle, his eyes darting between the tablet screen held by his pale associate and the calm, unyielding figure of Arthur Vance. The very legal mechanism Vanguard had used to strip Arthur of his livelihood, the meticulous, unyielding leverage of contractual clauses, had been turned against them with absolute, mathematical precision. They had forced the tractor onto the auction block to squeeze a few extra dollars out of Arthur's remaining possessions, and in doing so, they had handed him the keys to the entire valley. This is a manufactured conflict, Sterling muttered, his voice shaking as he tried to piece together a coherent legal defense on the fly. He stepped closer to the stage, looking up at the auctioneer. Mr. Auctioneer, the bank cannot proceed with the sale of lot 415 under these conditions. The title is clouded by a material omission. We demand an immediate administrative recess to review the statutory validity of the 1974 charter. The charter is fully valid, Mr. Sterling, Arthur interrupted, stepping forward to stand beside the clerk's desk. It has been cited in 4 separate county infrastructure bonds over the last 30 years, most recently in 2012 when the county repaired the Western Spillway Gate. The bank's legal team simply failed to conduct a proper asset linkage evaluation. That is not a cloud on the title, that is a professional oversight by your client. Behind the corporate rows, the local farmers were no longer hiding their satisfaction. Whispers turned into low rumbles of conversation, and a few men even leaned back in their chairs, crossing their arms with broad, triumphant grins. They had spent months watching Vanguard buy up their neighbors' land through aggressive foreclosures, feeling entirely powerless against the corporate machine. Now, they were watching a single man with a $9 receipt bring a multi-billion-dollar acquisition strategy to a grinding halt. Henderson. Sterling hissed, turning his back on Arthur to confront the bank's representative. Fix this. Your bank guaranteed a clean, unencumbered transfer of this agricultural parcel. If we cannot break ground on the logistics facility because of a rusted piece of scrap metal, Vanguard will file a breach of warranty suit against First Federal before the courts close this afternoon. We will sue for the full projected value of the logistics hub, $50 million. Attorney Henderson looked as if she might faint. She was staring at her tablet, her fingers frantically scrolling through the indemnification clauses of the foreclosure agreement. Marcus, the bank indemnified the real estate title, yes, but the equipment schedule was processed under a separate standard liquidation warranty. The agreement explicitly states that all personal property assets sold on the block are transferred as is, where is, with no implied warranty of merchantability or fitness for a specific purpose. You didn't buy the tractor. He did. Then buy it back from him. Sterling snapped, his corporate veneer completely cracking as his voice echoed off the corrugated metal walls. He whirled around to face Arthur, pulling an expensive gold pen from his pocket and reaching into his leather folio for a blank corporate checkbook. All right, Arthur. You've had your fun. You found a typo in an old book and you used it to embarrass us. Fine. You played your hand perfectly. Let's talk numbers. Sterling ripped a check from the book and laid it flat against the back of a plastic chair, his pen hovering over the paper. $9 was your investment. I will offer you $50,000, right now, in certified corporate funds, for the immediate title transfer of serial number MF74109X. You walk out of here with a clean slate, your personal debts wiped out, and enough cash to retire comfortably anywhere you want. 50 grand for a piece of junk that doesn't even have an engine block. What do you say? The room went entirely quiet again. $50,000 was an immense amount of money for a bankrupt farmer in the Blackwood Valley. It was enough to buy a small home in town, away from the stresses of a failing agricultural market. The farmers in the back row stopped smiling, their eyes locked on Arthur, wondering if the old man would take the payout and let the corporate machine win after all. Arthur looked down at the blank check, then up at Sterling's sweating face. His expression didn't soften. $50,000 is a lot of money, Mr. Sterling. But it doesn't buy back a century of family history. It doesn't restore the topsoil your surveyors plan to pave over with 3 feet of industrial concrete. And it certainly doesn't protect the water rights of the 6 independent farms remaining in the lower basin. Arthur stepped away from the check, his voice dropping into a cold, resonant register. I didn't buy that tractor to make a profit, Mr. Sterling. I bought it to enforce the law. And according to the law, the Western Spillway easement cannot be sold, transferred, or compromised without a full environmental impact assessment conducted by the County Agricultural Board. Until that board is re-established and a formal hearing is scheduled, no construction permits can be issued for this land. You old fool, Sterling whispered, his face turning a dark, furious crimson. You think you can stop a project of this scale? We have political backing. We have state infrastructure grants. We will tie you up in federal appellate courts for the next 10 years until every dime you have is gone. I don't have any dimes left, Mr. Sterling, Arthur said quietly, gesturing to his frayed canvas jacket. The bank already took them all. I have nothing left to lose. But you have a $50 million development timeline that is currently ticking away by the minute. The tension inside the pavilion had reached a breaking point, stretching so thin it felt as though the corrugated steel walls themselves might buckle under the weight of it. Marcus Sterling stood with his gold pen hovering over the blank check, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He wasn't looking at a bankrupt farmer anymore, he was looking at an immovable legal barrier. Every second that ticked by on his smartwatch represented thousands of dollars in idling corporate capital, delayed equipment leases, and furious calls from Vanguard's board of directors. Before Sterling could utter another threat, the heavy double doors at the back of the pavilion swung open with a loud, metallic clatter. The sudden burst of bright morning sunlight cut through the dim, dust-choked air of the room, causing dozens of people to shield their eyes. A tall, sharp-featured man in a dark charcoal suit strode down the center aisle. He wasn't one of Vanguard's local associates, nor was he a representative of the local credit union. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and held a document stamped with a prominent, embossed gold seal. Mr. Auctioneer, the man called out, his voice carrying the distinct, unhurried authority of a state official. My name is Lawrence Vance, representing the State Department of Environmental Protection, Bureau of Water Infrastructure. A collective murmur rippled through the local farmers. Arthur didn't turn around, a subtle, knowing nod was the only indication that he recognized the newcomer. Lawrence was Arthur's nephew, a sharp legal mind who had left the valley 15 years prior to study environmental law at the state capitol. He had spent the last 72 hours buried in the state library archives, verifying the exact statutory continuity of the 1974 Blackwood Valley Water and Irrigation Charter. Lawrence stopped at the front row, ignoring Marcus Sterling entirely as he handed the gold-sealed document directly up to the auctioneer. I am serving you with a formal, emergency administrative stay of execution regarding Lot 415. The State Regulatory Compliance Office has just filed a temporary restraining order in the Circuit Court, freezing the liquidation of the Vance agricultural parcel effective immediately. The auctioneer, Miller, looked at the document as if it were a live grenade. A restraining order? On what grounds, Counselor? The foreclosure order was signed by a federal judge. The foreclosure order covers the ownership of the real property, but it cannot override state environmental protections, Lawrence explained smoothly, turning to face the room. An hour ago, Mr. Arthur Vance legally filed his newly acquired equipment title for serial number MF74109X with the county registrar. Because that specific mechanical asset is now privately held outside the foreclosure estate, and because its non-severable water easement directly controls the western spillway, the state must step in. We cannot allow a private real estate transfer to proceed when the primary infrastructure mechanism governing public resource distribution is in legal dispute. Lawrence looked directly at Sterling, who looked as if he was about to have a stroke. To put it in plain terms, Mr. Sterling, until the state determines how your proposed logistics hub will operate without infringing upon Mr. Vance's exclusive statutory right to manage the valley's water flow, this land cannot change hands. The auction is frozen. Miller didn't hesitate. He looked at the state seal, looked at the pale face of the bank's attorney, and realized that his liability insurance wouldn't cover the catastrophic legal fallout of ignoring a state injunction. He picked up his wooden gavel, his hand steady but his face completely drained of color. In light of the administrative stay served by the State Department of Environmental Protection, Miller announced, his voice echoing off the rafters, the bidding for Lot 415 is officially suspended. This auction is frozen pending a formal judicial review. Ladies and gentlemen, this session is adjourned. The sharp, final crack of the gavel hitting the block signaled the end of the line. For a second, no one moved. Then, the back rows erupted. The local farmers stood up, cheering and clapping, throwing their worn work caps into the air. It wasn't just a temporary victory for Arthur, it was a total disruption of the corporate wave that had threatened to wipe them all off the map. Sterling didn't say a word. He violently slammed his leather folio shut, shoved his gold pen back into his pocket, and stormed out of the pavilion, his team of terrified associates scurrying after him like mice. Arthur Vance remained seated for a moment, letting the noise wash over him. He slowly reached into his jacket, pulled out his yellow carbon receipt for the $9 tractor, and smiled. The tension inside the pavilion had reached a breaking point, stretching so thin it felt as though the corrugated steel walls themselves might buckle under the weight of it. Marcus Sterling stood with his gold pen hovering over the blank check, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. He wasn't looking at a bankrupt farmer anymore, he was looking at an immovable legal barrier. Every second that ticked by on his smartwatch represented thousands of dollars in idling corporate capital, delayed equipment leases, and furious calls from Vanguard's board of directors. Before Sterling could utter another threat, the heavy double doors at the back of the pavilion swung open with a loud, metallic clatter. The sudden burst of bright morning sunlight cut through the dim, dust-choked air of the room, causing dozens of people to shield their eyes. A tall, sharp-featured man in a dark charcoal suit strode down the center aisle. He wasn't one of Vanguard's local associates, nor was he a representative of the local credit union. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and held a document stamped with a prominent, embossed gold seal. "Mr. Auctioneer," the man called out, his voice carrying the distinct, unhurried authority of a state official. "My name is Lawrence Vance, representing the State Department of Environmental Protection, Bureau of Water Infrastructure." A collective murmur rippled through the local farmers. Arthur didn't turn around, a subtle, knowing nod was the only indication that he recognized the newcomer. Lawrence was Arthur's nephew, a sharp legal mind who had left the valley 15 years prior to study environmental law at the state capitol. He had spent the last 72 hours buried in the state library archives, verifying the exact statutory continuity of the 1974 Blackwood Valley Water and Irrigation Charter. Lawrence stopped at the front row, ignoring Marcus Sterling entirely as he handed the gold-sealed document directly up to the auctioneer. "I am serving you with a formal, emergency administrative stay of execution regarding Lot 415. The State Regulatory Compliance Office has just filed a temporary restraining order in the Circuit Court, freezing the liquidation of the Vance agricultural parcel effective immediately." The auctioneer, Miller, looked at the document as if it were a live grenade. "A restraining order? On what grounds, Counselor?" "The foreclosure order was signed by a federal judge. The foreclosure order covers the ownership of the real property, but it cannot override state environmental protections," Lawrence explained smoothly, turning to face the room. An hour ago, Mr. Arthur Vance legally filed his newly acquired equipment title for serial number MF741109X with the county registrar. Because that specific mechanical asset is now privately held outside the foreclosure estate, and because its non-severable water easement directly controls the western spillway, the state must step in. We cannot allow a private real estate transfer to proceed when the primary infrastructure mechanism governing public resource distribution is in legal dispute. Lawrence looked directly at Sterling, who looked as if he was about to have a stroke. To put it in plain terms, Mr. Sterling, until the state determines how your proposed logistics hub will operate without infringing upon Mr. Vance's exclusive statutory right to manage the valley's water flow, this land cannot change hands. The auction is frozen. Miller didn't hesitate. He looked at the state seal, looked at the pale face of the bank's attorney, and realized that his liability insurance wouldn't cover the catastrophic legal fallout of ignoring a state injunction. He picked up his wooden gavel, his hand steady but his face completely drained of color. In light of the administrative stay served by the State Department of Environmental Protection, Miller announced, his voice echoing off the rafters, the bidding for Lot 415 is officially suspended. This auction is frozen pending a formal judicial review. Ladies and gentlemen, this session is adjourned. The sharp, final crack of the gavel hitting the block signaled the end of the line. For a second, no one moved. Then, the back rows erupted. The local farmers stood up, cheering and clapping, throwing their worn work caps into the air. It wasn't just a temporary victory for Arthur, it was a total disruption of the corporate wave that had threatened to wipe them all off the map. Sterling didn't say a word. He violently slammed his leather folio shut, shoved his gold pen back into his pocket, and stormed out of the pavilion, his team of terrified associates scurrying after him like mice. Arthur Vance remained seated for a moment, letting the noise wash over him. He slowly reached into his jacket, pulled out his yellow carbon receipt for the $9 tractor, and smiled.